because big money has trumped the political process there. And Citizens United, which ruled that corporations, large economic interests, have the right to unleash vast sums of undisclosed money into our political process in the days just before an election, is going to further swamp the participation and impact of citizens. I'm very much for corporations. I know you have many big and good ones here in Minnesota. They are marvelous at organizing capital and producing goods and service, but they should not have a greater role in the political process. I very much believe that rich people should be allowed to buy more vacations, buy more homes, buy more cars, and buy more gizmos, but they shouldn't be allowed to buy more democracy. And yet, Thank you. Thank you for that welcome. I thought you told me this was a foreclosure. And I came because I had a chance at this beautiful home. But thank you very much for your hospitality, and thanks to all of you for coming out. You are fortunate that I have an implacable deadline with Garrison at 6 o'clock, so you don't have to stand here and hear me make a long-winded speech. I want to say just a few things. First of all, Ellen and Peter are the embodiment to me of the highest office in the land, which is Ellen and Peter are the embodiment to me of the highest office in the land, and that is the office of citizen. We talk about the president being the highest officer in the land. It isn't true. The citizen is the first and the highest office, and Ellen and her work and Peter as her accomplice have introduced me in St. Paul and Minnesota to a number of other people like you who fill that office with distinction, because without you, our democracy would be even more dysfunctional than it is today. And it is more dysfunctional than I have seen it in my lifetime. Our America remains a place of great promise, but it's a broken promise because our politics is not functioning for the everyday people who rely upon the cooperative efforts of other citizens through government to achieve their aspirations as citizens of this country. It is broken because big money is dominant in politics. Too many politicians with the support of their voters come to office only to execute public policies that benefit not the voters but the donors. If the owner of the Minnesota Vikings called the chief umpire of a game in the World Series to his office and handed him $10,000 in cash, we would call that what it is, a bribe. But in politics, it's called a campaign contribution. And campaign contributions are now what most incumbents spend their time trying to raise. And it means they give more of an earful to the people who have contributed to their campaigns than they do to the people who voted for them. Our politics is broken because of a perverted congressional redistricting system, which always favors incumbents or the most partisan ideologues in the political process. Our political process is broken because increasingly large numbers of voters feel pushed further and further from the actual process of electing public officials. That's one reason that I am a fan of instant runoff, or what you call ranked voting. I don't live in a city where it happens, although I hope New York City achieves that sooner than later. But there are several cities where friends of mine live around the country, including in Burlington, Vermont, where ranked voting, or what they call instant runoff, is proving to bring a greater participation on the part of citizens to vote in November than survive the very partisan primary in April or May. So this is a very important step toward what we have to have in this country, which is a major revitalization of our political process. It's incremental. Money in politics, public funding will help us solve that problem. Fair judicial redistricting of congressional districts will help us solve that problem. And instant runoff will help us get voters closer to the participation in the process. It takes all of these. But great change in America rarely comes in a moment, in an instant. It comes because a lot of people like you spend a lot of years of your lives working toward a particular parochial, local issue. After years of covering politics and being in 2 administrations in Washington, I'm convinced we are not going to get reform at the national level because big money has trumped the political process there. And Citizens United, which ruled that corporations, large economic interests, have the right to unleash vast sums of undisclosed money into our political process in the days just before an election, is going to further swamp the participation and impact of citizens. I'm very much for corporations. I know you have many big and good ones here in Minnesota. They are marvelous at organizing capital and producing goods and service, but they should not have a greater role in the political process. I very much believe that rich people should be allowed to buy more vacations, buy more homes, buy more cars, and buy more gizmos. But they shouldn't be allowed to buy more democracy. And yet, that is what is happening. And if we can reverse Citizens United, and there's a marvelous organization called Free Speech for People, freespeechforpeople.org, that is working on a constitutional amendment, a clean, simple constitutional amendment that would reverse the Citizens United decision and simply say that corporations are not persons under the First Amendment for the purposes of political ends. That would be a great step. But it takes incremental steps like you are doing here. I was in Washington, worked on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I remember seeing in my head a vast procession of people in the South, particularly young blacks who put themselves on the line, who were harassed, humiliated, persecuted, beaten, and punished for standing up for their rights. It took a long time before that reached the desk, the Oval Office of the President, and he signed the Voting Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. Maybe not in your time, but it is inevitable if we are to restore the promise of America that we have reforms like instant runoff. It will have to be across the board, putting piece by piece of the puzzle into place. So I urge you to think of what you're doing here locally, parochially, if I may use that word, as part of the long process of democracy that we must take back from the power of big money, from the perversion of ideology that determines our judicial redistricting now, and from the ability of both parties to limit the vote in primaries to make sure that the majority of citizens don't participate in November. So you're onto something very, very important. I said to a friend of mine on Wall Street not too long ago, what do you think about the market? And he said, well, I'm optimistic. And I said, then why do you look so worried? And he said, because I'm not sure my optimism is justified. Well, I grew up an optimist about America. My father was a poor working man in East Texas, but I was able to go to good public schools, drive on a public highway to a public university in Austin. I was able to use public libraries and other public facilities. I was as rich in the return on public investments as Ann Blaylock was, who was the daughter of the richest man in town and was in my class, because people kept alive the vitality of the public square, public space, and public place. I believe that's so embedded in us. We will continue to fight for it. So, while I am an optimist about democracy, I know that what was promised in the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was compromised by the Constitution, the owners of property, who said, yes, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but not for slaves, not for women, not for workers, not for immigrants, and not for Native Americans, who in the Declaration were referred to as savages. The point of this is that our story is a long story of trying to increase the franchise, trying to embrace more and more marginalized outside people, everyday people, into the fruits of our democracy. It's a long fight. I practice and have for years because I've been through very difficult times, very pessimistic times in politics, and I sometimes am close to despair. I can't afford despair because when I go to my computer at my office and at my home, I look at the pictures of my 5 grandchildren. Henry just graduated from high school and is on his way to Lewis and Clark. Thomas is 17, Nancy is 14, Jassy is 10, and Sarah is 5. They have no representative. They have no lobbyist. They have no vote. They just got a grandfather. And if I give up, if I quit, if I allow myself to wallow in despair, it's too late for them. So I practice what a political scientist named Gramsci in Italy wrote many years ago. I practice the pessimism of the mind, which is, as a journalist, I see the world as it is. No rose-colored glasses. No false illusions. I see the world as it is. But I practice the optimism of the will, which means that I cannot survive in my life, in my time, without believing in a more confident future. And then to get up every morning to do what I can to make that future come about. I have a larger platform than you. I have the venue of television, but that's no more important than the venue you're working in here as volunteers for one of the most important pieces of reform that will move us to the fulfillment of democracy for all of its citizens. Thank you for doing what you're doing.